Hi there, this is Robert of MayflowerBookshop.com, and today we're journeying into Man and the World of Stars by Rudolf Steiner. Over the years, I've talked to a lot of people who felt that the burning of the Goetheanum, which is a huge, if you don't know about this, Rudolf Steiner built a Goetheanum, a temple of the word, a John temple, the Gospel of John, that H.P. Blavatsky in the esoteric character of the Gospels makes a big thing of, and the Word, and the Christos, and Rudolf Steiner makes a big thing of it. And he built this wonderful place in Switzerland of these, like you might say, two globes meeting with the word or the voice coming from between and the two globes, between the inner and outer evolution awakens the consciousness of the fully human. Again, there's other talks I've given where I go into the Goetheanum. At this point, I just want to say that Rudolf Steiner built this wonderful sacred space and temple, TEMPO, of rhythm and stillness, that he claimed would be very difficult to be non-virtuous in, because it was a temple of the word, the vibration of at-one-ment with all that's good, true, and beautiful. I'm putting this in my words, but Steiner had this wonderful place for the revelation and the awakening of higher consciousness of spirit in our souls and bodies. And it was burnt down. It was burnt down on the evening of December 30th, 1922, in Dornach, Switzerland, after a talk that he gave, from New Year's Eve and going into New Year's Day. He gave a talk on the relation of the movement for religious, actually this is December 30th, the day before. Okay, I'm getting so excited, I'm getting a little bit, on New Year's Eve, 1922 going into 1923, of which the fire destroyed the first Goetheanum, and it was discovered 1 hour after this lecture he gave on New Year's Eve called Spiritual Knowledge is a True Communion, the Beginning of a Cosmic Cult Suitable for Men of the Present Age. And this particular talk, I've met people throughout the years, a lot of people have read that talk trying to figure out why it burnt. And it's my deep intuition and flash at one point, my revelation flash, that whoever burned it down were behind the walls setting up the fire while he was giving this talk on New Year's Eve. And that my thought is that the guy that burnt down the Goetheanum, it was a guy, not a woman, because a woman would have just thrown a teacup back then. The guys were the main war crew of the guys, right? And the guy was behind the walls, but he was at the talk on December 30th, 1922. The talk on the relation of the movement for religious revival and renewal. The relation of the movement for religious renewal to the Anthroposophical movement. What is the relation between the movement for religious renewal and the Anthroposophical movement? And something there where Steiner clearly states that anthroposophy is the main thing, and that all the movements, whether it's the religious renewal or the movement for the Waldorf education or biodynamic gardening, the medical movement, all these are centered in anthroposophy, that comes first. And I think somebody took offense at this. At least that's one of the ideas that I have. And that's why I want to read you the talk the day before the talk where they burned it down. Somebody burned it down. And I think that talk on New Year's Eve is worth reading. I think we should read that too and go through it, because that is a glimpse of Steiner at his most spiritual moment right before the place got burnt down. And, it's there that he distills the end of his talk where he says, "In earth activity draws near to me, given to me in substance imagined form. The heavenly being of the stars. In willing, I see them transformed with love. In watery life stream into me, forming me through with power of substance force. The heavenly deeds of the stars. In feeling, I see them transformed with wisdom." And he says right at the end of this talk, it's kind of amazing, actually. "I have wished to say this to you, as it were, as a beginning. Next Friday, I will speak further about the nature of this ritual in its relation to a real knowledge of nature. I appointed this lecture for this particular day with a special end in view. For today, when that being of time, which is given in the cycle of the year, is brought before our souls, when this year, at any rate for outward perception and experience, comes to an end, we should realize the nature of our relationship to time, how it rests. It rests with us out of the past to form and shape the future, to work actively for the future in order to create in the spirit." One of the poems recited this afternoon began with these words: "Every year finds new graves. Every year finds new graves. Every year finds new graves." This is Steiner at the end of his talk on New Year's Eve before the fire. Every year finds new graves! Exclamation point. That is profoundly true, but equally true is it that every year finds new cradles, new births, right? Steiner. As this year touches the past, so does it also touch the future. And today, it is man's first obligation to grasp this future, to reflect that the budding and sprouting life in the external world contains within it the seeds of death, and that we must seek for life with our own power of action. Every new year is a symbol of this truth. If we see on the one hand the graves, let us behold on the other hand self-renewing life, waiting to receive the seed of the future into itself. It is our great task this day to observe how in the world around us it is New Year's Eve. Awe is passing and disappearing and dying away. Awe is passing, disappearing and dying away. But how in the hearts of men who are conscious of their real manhood, of their divine humanity, there must be the mood of New Year, the mood of the beginning of a new era, of the uprising of new life. Let us not merely turn with a superficial festiveness from a symbolical New Year's Eve to a symbolical New Year's Day, but let us so turn our thoughts that they may indeed grow powerful and creative as evolution requires them to be. Let us turn our thoughts away from the dying phenomena which confront us everywhere in modern civilization, like old graves, away from New Year's Eve to the New Year's Day, to the day of the cosmic New Year. But that day will never dawn till man himself decides to bring it to pass. And then he has this mantric, poetic: in earth, activity draws near to me, given to me in substance, imaged form. The heavenly being of the stars, in willing, I see them transformed with love. In watery life stream into me, forming me through with power of substance force. The heavenly deeds of the stars, in feeling, I see them transformed with wisdom. And then we read back to December 30th, the night before, the evening before New Year's Eve. And Rudolf Steiner gives this talk, which is one to deeply ponder and wonder at. I have often said in this place that in more ancient times in the evolution of humanity, science, art, and religion formed a harmonious unity. Anyone who is able in one way or another to gain knowledge of the nature of the ancient mysteries knows that within these mysteries, knowledge was sought as a revelation of the spiritual in picture form, in the way that was possible in those times. That way, that picture form way, that way can no longer be ours. Although in this age we must again advance to a knowledge of the spiritual nature of the world. A pictorial knowledge of the spiritual lay at the foundation of all ancient conceptions of the world. This knowledge came to direct expression not merely by being communicated in words, but through forms which have gradually become those of our arts. Bodily, plastic presentation in the plastic arts, and presentation by means of tone and word in the arts of music and speech. But this second stage was followed by the third stage, that of the revelation of the nature of the world in religious cult or ritual, a revelation through which the whole man felt himself uplifted to the divine spiritual ground of the world, not merely in thought, nor merely in feeling, as happens through art, but in such a way that thoughts, feelings, and also the inmost impulses of the will surrendered themselves in reverent devotion to this divine spiritual principle. And the sacred acts and rites were the means whereby the external actions of man's will were to be filled with spirit. Men felt the living unity in science as it was then conceived, art and religion. The living unity in science, art, and religion. The ideal of the spiritual life of the present day must be, once more to gain knowledge that can bring to realization what Goethe already divined, a knowledge that raises itself to art. Not symbolical or allegorical art, but true art, which means creative, formative activity in tones and in words, in art which also deepens into direct religious experience. The experience. Yeah, I just want to comment. I mean, that's what we need, is a direct experience of the oneness and the universal knowing and love. And I think that that gives us a sense of self and other that can't let us down. Okay, back to Steiner. Isn't this fun? I love reading. It's like reading to each other, you know. Okay, Rudolf Steiner. Only when anthroposophical spiritual science is seen to contain this impulse within it is its true being understood. Obviously, humanity will have to take many steps in spiritual development before such an ideal can be realized. But it is just the patient devotion to the taking of these steps which must bring blessing to the anthroposophical movement. Now, I should like, in the series of lectures now being given, to speak from one particular aspect on this impulse in the anthroposophical movement to which reference has just been made. Perhaps, my dear friends, at the close of what I have to say, you will understand what is really the deeper cause of my words. Let me say, in the first place, that already for a long time now, the anthroposophical movement has not coincided with the Anthroposophical Society. but that the Anthroposophical Society, if it would fulfill its task, must really carry the whole impulse of the Anthroposophical movement. The Anthroposophical movement was laid hold of wider circles than merely the Anthroposophical Society. Hence it has come about that in more recent years, the way of working had necessarily to be different for the Anthroposophical movement from what it was when the Anthroposophical movement was essentially contained within the Anthroposophical Society. But the Anthroposophical Society can only fulfill its real nature when it feels itself as the kernel of the Anthroposophical movement. Now, in order not to speak merely theoretically, but to make what I have just said really intelligible, I must tell you a little about something that has recently taken place in connection with a movement that is distinct from the Anthroposophical movement. Because if I did not do this, misunderstanding might easily arise. I would therefore narrate briefly the manner in which a certain movement, having a religious cultic character, has arisen, a movement which indeed has much to do with the Anthroposophical movement, but should not be confused with it. It is the religious movement which calls itself the movement for religious renewal. The movement was the beginning of the Christian community. This movement of religious renewal is the beginning of the Christian community, as has since been called. The religious movement, which calls itself the movement for religious renewal, for the renewal of Christianity. The position of this movement with respect to the Anthroposophical movement will become clear if we take our start from the forms in which this movement for religious renewal has developed. Some time ago, a few enthusiastic young theological students came to me. They were about to conclude their theological studies and enter upon the practical duties of ministers of religion. What they said to me was to the following effect. When at the present time a student receives with a really devoted Christian heart the theology offered to him at the universities, he feels at last as if he had no firm ground under his feet for the practical work of a minister that is before him. The theology and religion of our time has gradually assumed forms that do not really enable it to instill into its ministries and ministers for their practical work and their care of souls the impulse that must proceed as a living power from the mystery of Golgotha, from the consciousness that the Christ being, who formerly lived in spiritual worlds, has since united himself with human life on earth and now works on further in that life. I perceive that in the souls of those who came to me, there was the feeling that if Christianity is to be kept alive, a renewal of the entire theological impulse and of the entire religious impulse is necessary. Otherwise, Christianity cannot be really a vital force for our whole spiritual life. And it is indeed clear that the religious impulse only assumes its true significance and meaning when it lays hold of a man or woman so deeply that it pervades everything he brings forth out of his thinking, feeling, and will. I just want to, as an aside, also share that a few places Rudolf Steiner mentions that unless the Waldorf school impulse, unless Christianity were to really embrace anthroposophy, the anthroposophical movement, basically in another place he says the 4 and the 3 or the 7 earth evolutions, which Blavatsky calls rounds, and each of those is divided by 7, and each of those is divided by 7, and probably each of those is divided by 7, which leads us into the Aquarian Age now. But Rudolf Steiner said that unless Waldorf school impulses of the teachers were to study Outline of Occult Science and Esoteric Science, right, the 7 earth evolutions, unless all the spiritual anthroposophical movements were to grasp and understand and put to work the 7 earth evolutions as being here all at once, but we're going through it. And also the triple soul of sentient, intellectual, and consciousness soul and the higher awakening of the Manas Buddhi Atma, or the spirit self, life spirit, and spirit human, that unless one grasped that Christianity would fail. Unless Christianity entered into the will of this, like in Theosophy of the Rosicrucian, he mentions this, that Christianity would fail, and that even Waldorf education would fail. So I wanted to mention that as we're reading, because he's hinting at that now. In Steiner's nice Pisces way, he's not hinting, he's directly saying. So Steiner, I remarked first of all to those who came to me in this way for help in what they were seeking and could only find where anthroposophical spiritual science is making its way into the world today. I pointed out to them that one cannot work from the enthusiasm of a few single individuals, but that it is a question of gathering together. Gathering together, as it were, similar strivings in wider circles. Yeah, wider circles than even the Anthroposophic, that we can bring all the spiritual circles together. Right? This is what I'm trying to do in these talks. Okay, so back to Steiner. It's, striving in ever widening circles, even though the striving may be more or less unconscious. I said to these people that theirs was obviously not an isolated striving. Rather, was it the case that they were feeling in their hearts, perhaps more intensely than others, what countless human beings of the present day are also feeling. And I showed them that if it is a question of religious renewal, one must start from a broad basis whereon can be found a large number of persons out of whose hearts springs the impulse to strive for that renewal. After a while, the people in question came to me again. They had fully accepted what I had said to them, and now they were able to tell me that they had been joined by a considerable number of other young theological students who were in the same position, that is to say, who were dissatisfied with the present theological and religious aims at the universities, and yet were about to enter upon the practical duties of ministers of the church, and there seemed every aspect of the circle being increased. I said, it is quite obvious, first of all, that it is not only a question of having a band of preachers and ministers, but into such a movement for religious renewal should be drawn not only those who can teach and perform the duties of pastors, but above all those, and they are very numerous, who possess more or less dimly in their hearts a strong religious impulse, a specifically Christian impulse, which, in view of the way in which theological religion has developed, cannot be satisfied. I pointed out, therefore, that there are circles of people in the population who are not within the Anthroposophical movement, and who, from the whole tenor of their mind and heart, do not immediately find their way into the Anthroposophical movement. I further remarked that for the Anthroposophical movement, it is ultimately a case of seeing clearly and distinctly that we are living in an age when simply through the world's evolution, a number of spiritual truths regarding the actual spiritual content of the world. We're looking for spiritual content of the world, my friends. Yes, Steiner. Can be found by men and women when they become spiritual researchers. And if men and women do not become spiritual researchers, but strive after the truth in the way in which it must disclose itself to man when he is conscious of his human dignity, then the truths discovered by spiritual researchers can be understood by such persons by means of their ordinary sound human intellect, provided it is really sound. This sounds like Emerson's common sense, doesn't it? I went on to say, Steiner says, that the Anthroposophical movement is founded upon the principle that he who finds his way into it knows that what is important above all is that the spiritual truths now accessible to humanity should lay hold of the human heart and minds as knowledge, real knowledge. The essential thing is that knowledge should enter the spiritual life of mankind, men and women. It is, of course, not the case that one who is in the Anthroposophical movement need be versed in the various sciences. One may be in the Anthroposophical movement without possessing any impulse or any inclination towards natural science. For the truths of anthroposophy are perfectly comprehensible to the human intellect if only it is healthy and unclouded by prejudice. If already at the present time a sufficiently large number of persons out of the natural tendencies of the heart and mind are to find their way to anthroposophical movement, then all that is necessary for religious aims and religious ideals would also gradually develop together with anthroposophical knowledge out of the anthroposophical movement. But there are, as I have already said, a great number of people who have the above-mentioned urge toward a renewal of religion. That is to say, toward a renewal of Christian religion, and who simply through being in certain circles of the cultural life cannot find their way into the Anthroposophical movement. Did you hear that? That's pretty heavy. A great number of people who have the above-mentioned urge toward a renewal of religion, that is to say, toward a renewal of Christian religion, and who simply through being in certain circles of this cultural life cannot find their way into the Anthroposophical movement. What is necessary for these people at the present time is that a path suited to them should be found, leading to the spiritual life appropriate to the humanity of the present day. I pointed out that it was a matter of forming communities, that what is to be reached in anthroposophy can be attained first of all in the single individual, but that out of the knowledge thus gained in an individual way, there must flow by an absolute inner necessity the ethical and religious social activity that is requisite for the future of humanity. I might add that all great spiritual breakthroughs in research, it really happens with just the individual alone. And that's why so many people buy Steiner books that don't go to the Anthroposophical Society. I mean, same with Theosophy, same with Buddhism. I mean, but that Steiner's saying here that the second step is to try to find groups and community, right? That's a second step, but not a first step. Okay, I'm just trying to explain it. So let's go on with Steiner. I pointed out that it was a matter of forming communities, that what is to be reached in anthroposophy can be attained first of all in the single individual, but that out of the knowledge thus gained in an individual way, there must flow by an absolute inner necessity the ethical and religious social activity that is requisite for the future of humanity. It is therefore a question of giving something to those people who are at first unable to set out directly along the path to the Anthroposophical movement. The spiritual path for them must be sought by forming communities in which heart and soul and spirit work together, a path adapted to human evolution at its present stage. Seems like here he's talking about joining communities, maybe, and you're not ready for anthroposophy yet. You're joining spiritual groups, I think. Tell me what you think. Steiner. What I then had to say out of the needs of our human evolution to those persons who came to me may be summed up approximately in the words, "It is necessary for the evolution of humanity at the present time that the Anthroposophical movement should grow more and more in accordance with the conditions which underlie it, and which consist especially in this, that the spiritual truths which want to come to us from the spiritual world should first of all enter the hearts of men and women directly, so that men and women may be strengthened by these spiritual truths. They will then find the way, which will be, on the one hand, an artistic way, and on the other, a religious, ethical, and social way. The Anthroposophical movement has gone along this path since its inception, and for the Anthroposophical movement, no other path is necessary, if only this path be rightly understood. The need for another path arises for those who cannot directly take this one of the Anthroposophical movement, but who, through community building and corporate endeavor within the community, must follow a different path, one which only later will join the Anthroposophical path. Wow. Oh, Steiner didn't say wow there, but I think he says wow sometimes, but they take it out of the lectures. You know, I'm sharing this, that my good friend David Spangler who I turned on to Anthroposophy and Steiner, and he turned on Weimer and Thompson, the author of Coming into Being. That quote, by the way, I think it's in Steiner, but it's also in Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine. David Spangler made it a point of meeting way back everybody he could that had met Steiner. And he said that everyone, like, he met quite a few people that had met Steiner, and he said that everybody who met Steiner described Steiner completely different, as if it was a different person completely. And that the one thing that Steiner had going was a sense of humor. That he'd always tell these jokes, and have a sense of humor at the beginning and throughout his lecture, often near the end. And that the stenographers had taken all this humor and wit, and that I talk about Emerson's idea about humor and wit, they took all Steiner's jokes out because they were afraid that people wouldn't take him seriously. So the only jokes that are left in Rudolf Steiner's writings and lectures and talks are the ones that the stenographers didn't get. A lot of people don't get the joke. Life is a joke. Life is like a tragedy. Shakespeare only wrote tragedy humor because from the lower point of view, it's a tragedy and you will die, and probably a lot of people aren't going to get it. But from the higher point of view, it's a comedy. What we put ourselves through to get this amazing insight that makes us laugh at what used to be tragic. Okay, so I'm just babbling here. Let's go on to what Steiner's talking about. He's saying that if you're not really ready for anthroposophy, you might have to later join up with them. He's calling it the Anthroposophical movement. And that if you're not ready for it, you might have to be in one of these secondary things, these paths of communities. Okay, Steiner says, in this way, the prospect has opened for two movements to travel side by side. There is the Anthroposophical movement, which attains its true aims when it adheres with intelligence and vigor to the meaning and purpose originally contained in it, and is not led astray by any special fields of work that are bound to open up as time goes on. Even the field of scientific work, for example, must not encroach upon the impulse of the general anthroposophical movement. We must clearly understand that it is the anthroposophical impulse which constitutes the anthroposophical movement. And although various fields of scientific work have recently been started within the anthroposophical movement, it is absolutely necessary that the power and energy of the general anthroposophical impulse should not be weakened. In particular, the anthroposophical impulse must not be drawn into the forms of thinking and ideation prevailing in various fields of science, which ought actually to be vitalized by it and be colored by them to such an extent that anthroposophy becomes, let us say, chemical as chemistry is today, physical as physics is today, or biological as biology is today. That must not happen on any account. It would strike at the very heart of the anthroposophical movement. What is essential is that the anthroposophical movement, anthro meaning thinker or man, manas, the Sophie wisdom of manas, right? Anthro, of manas, the manu, the wisdom of the manas, thinking. Okay, I'm adding. It's interesting that after the Goetheanum burns, Steiner goes, instead of putting emphasis on a descent of the higher into the lower, he discovers the lower. He discovers the Christos in everything, the most highest spiritual spark in everything, and works bottom up with gardening, biodynamics, Waldorf education, color theory, drama, art. He just comes bottom up with everything. Right now he's talking about how anthroposophy blesses all these other things, but that you can't get lost in those things. That's not anthroposophy. Okay, Steiner, that must not happen. What is essential is that the anthroposophical movement shall preserve its spiritual purity, but also its spiritual energy. To this end, it must embody the essential nature of the anthroposophical spirituality, must live and move in it, and bring forth out of the spiritual revelations of the present day everything that seeks to penetrate also into the life of science. Side by side with this, so I said at that time, there might be such a movement for religious renewal, which of course has no significance for those who find the way to anthroposophy, but is intended for those who, to begin with, cannot find this way to anthroposophy. Oh my God, I'm just adding, did that burn down? The big G? Okay. The seventh principle. The Christos, the Atma, that permeates the Buddhic, the life spirit is a vehicle for the spirit human. Manas is a vehicle for compassion and love. The thinking, feeling, and willing in the sense of I is a vehicle and cup for the universal mind and love, compassion, and universal life, the one. Okay, Steiner. Taking for granted, therefore, that the Anthroposophical movement will remain what it was and what it ought to be, I gave something quite independently of the Anthroposophical movement to a number of persons who, from their own impulse, not mine, wished to work for the movement for religious renewal. I gave what I was in a position to give, in respect of what a future theology needs. And I also gave the contents of the ceremonial and ritual required by this new community. Wow. What I have been able to give to these people out of these people, there's a little humor right there. What I have been able to give to these people out of the conditions pertaining to spiritual knowledge at the present time, I have given as a man to other men. What I have given them has nothing to do with the Anthroposophical movement. Yeah, that reminds me of Jesus is every man, Christ is no man. Or wisdom of Theosophy. So, once you become Christed or anointed or initiated, the Christos becomes the Christos. Blavatsky goes way long-winded into Ahriman and Lucifer, and the Christos is our trials and tribulations, and then you become the Christos. And this is pre-Christian, right? To say nothing of Pistis Sophia, the divine knowing of Sophia and the wisdom that was the closest thing to the Christos, the Buddhic principle closest to the Atmic principle. Okay, let's get back to Steiner. What I've given them has nothing to do with the Anthroposophical movement. As a private individual, I've given it to them in such a way that I've emphasized with the necessary firmness that the Anthroposophical movement must not have anything to do with this movement of religious renewal. Above all, that I am not the founder of this movement, and I rely upon this being made quite clear to the world. To individuals who wish to found this movement for religious renewal, I have given the necessary counsels, which are consonant with, consonant versus verb, maybe, which are consonant with the practice of an authentic and inwardly vital cult, filled with spiritual content, to be celebrated in a right way with the forces out of the spiritual world. When I gave this advice, I never performed a ritualistic act myself. Did he never have communion too? I don't know. I only showed step by step to those who wish to enact the ceremonies how they have to be performed. That was necessary. And today it is also necessary that within the Anthroposophical Society, this should be correctly understood. The movement for religious renewal, therefore, was founded independently of me, independently of the Anthroposophical Society. I only gave advice. The one who started it, the one who performs the very first ceremony in this movement, performed it under my guidance, but I had no part whatever in the founding of this movement. It is a movement which originated of itself, but received counsel from me, because when advice is justifiably asked in any particular sphere of work, it is a human duty. Duty means dharma, by the way. It is a human dharma, duty, if one can give the advice, to do so. I might add that at the end of Blavatsky's life, a lot of confusion took place when she had died, and they fought over who was to run the thing. And just like Ida Wegman got thrown out, William Q. Judge got thrown out. A lot of similarities between the Theosophical Society and the Anthroposophical Society. And Blavatsky often claimed that that the Theosophical Society was messing up so much here and there that maybe she shouldn't even be a member. And remember, Rudolf Steiner re-accepted and assumed the responsibility for the Anthroposophical Society at the foundation stone of the new Goetheanum laid within the hearts of the members after the burning of the Goetheanum. And Ida Wegman later was thrown out, and Steiner was thrown out of the Theosophical Society when he was the head of the esoteric school of Theosophy, like his own inner school of the first class. There was going to be a second and third. The esoteric school of Theosophy, of which he was the head, had 3 degrees. The first one was you only listen to the talks. And there's a lot of similarities in Masonry and the 3 ruffians and the 3 goons that kind of attack in the first degree. I mean, I should probably stop talking about that. That would be a whole nother talk. But it's really interesting that he's totally supporting the movement for religious renewal in the Christian community. And he's totally supporting Waldorf school and the gardening later, biodynamic gardening and many of the other eurythmy and everything else. But he's like sharing that there's something to do with anthroposophy that brings us together in a purely spiritual way. It's like music. It's like you hear a song within that weaves through all the hearts, and you become a member of that because you're one of the singers. You're part of the orchestration. You're both the being, the spiritual being, and the conductivity of the Great Father and Mother. Our mind unites with the higher intelligence that works with the Great Mother and Father, the Atma Buddha. For those of you who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, you really, really need to go to Mayflower Bookshop and get The Key to Theosophy and Isis, a Veiled and Secret Doctrine by Blavatsky, her esoteric character of the Gospels. If you're an anthroposophist and believe in Christianity, you really should look at that, because Steiner got a lot of ideas about John there, and the source of the word John and Shan Buddhism and the stanzas of John. The stanzas of John, the Secret Doctrine is based on the stanzas of John, which are John and Dzyan, of which it means wisdom that we activate with love. Bottom line. Okay, so I'm getting a little lost here, and I want to try to keep this within one talk. Let's see if I can do it. So the movement of religious renewal was independent of Rudolf Steiner, independent of the society. He only gave advice. He didn't perform any rituals. There was just his guidance, and he took no part in the founding of this movement, he says, because his higher self somehow helped. It is a movement which originated of itself, but received counsel from me, Steiner says, because when advice is justifiably asked in any particular sphere of work, it's human duty to give advice. Do so. Thus, it must be understood, in the strictest sense of the word, that alongside the Anthroposophical movement, another movement was founded out of itself, not out of the Anthroposophical movement. For the reason that, so I guess he just gave some kind of knowledge to it, but it was founded out of these people that wanted that. For the reason that outside the Anthroposophical Society, there are numbers of people who cannot find their way into the Anthroposophical movement itself, but who will be able to come to it later on. Therefore, strict distinctions must be made between the Anthroposophical movement and the Anthroposophical Society and the movement for religious renewal. And it is important that anthroposophy should not be looked upon as the founder of this movement for religious renewal. This was a big problem in the Theosophical Society, that the people that were in the esoteric school of Theosophy and in their secret Egyptian rites and their secret Masonry rites and all these kind of secret healing and angel things going on, they ended up being the people who ran the Theosophical Society. And Blavatsky made it really clear that these sub-movements should not, the leaders of those should not be in leadership positions in the Theosophical Society. And this is a problem with Anthroposophical Society, is the same people run all these different cliques, and rather than initiatives of higher truth and love. So this is something that I'm saying. The Anthroposophical Society recently, with the help of Peter Selg and a good, wonderful friend, Prokofiev, they brought Wegman officially back into the society. And I think that the Theosophical Society should bring Rudolf Steiner back in, and the Anthroposophical Society should reaccept H.P. Blavatsky and judge as early anthroposophist. Yay! I said it. There, I said it. And I think that I'm still thinking of a word, but I think we should really get together and start a new theosophy, a new theosophy based on this wisdom action, this Sophia Dharma. Maybe it could be called Sophia Dharma, the new theosophy, the new anthroposophy in today's world. I'm just sharing creative ideas. Like when I gave a talk at the Anthroposophical Society on Getty's Road in Ann Arbor, a branch meeting there, I had a lot of ideas. So I just share ideas so that we can spark each other, do our own research, and come up with our own ideas. I'm not an authority. I'm just a fellow student sharing my year in the secret invisible university of the Rose and Cross and the golden nights, because we've discovered the gold in the night of our modern Kali Yuga world. Steiner. And it is important that anthroposophy should not be looked upon as the founder of this movement for religious renewal. This has nothing to do with the fact that the advice which makes this religious renewal into a real spiritual community in a form suited to the present age of human evolution was given in all love and also in all devotion to the spiritual powers who are able to place such a movement in the world today. Yeah, just think of the circle and cross when they make the cross. That is a Rosicrucian sigil, right? Okay, Steiner. So that this movement has only originated in the right way when it considers what is within the Anthroposophical movement as something that gives it a sure ground, and when it puts its trust in the Anthroposophical movement and seeks help and counsel from those who are within the Anthroposophical movement, and so on. Taking into account the fact that the opponents of the Anthroposophical movement today consider every method of attack justifiable, points such as these must be made quite clear. And I must here declare that everyone who is honest and sincere with respect to the Anthroposophical movement would be obliged to deny any statement to the effect that the movement for religious renewal was founded at Dornach in the Goetheanum and by the Goetheanum. Wow. For that is not the case. The facts are as I have just presented them. Thus, in view of the way in which I myself have helped this movement for religious renewal to find its feet, I have necessarily had to picture to myself that this movement, which puts its trust in the Anthroposophical movement and regards the Anthroposophical movement as its forerunner, will look for adherents outside the Anthroposophical Society, and that it would consider it a grave mistake to carry into the Anthroposophical Society the work and aims which are indeed necessary outside that society. For the Anthroposophical Society is not understood by one who belongs to it, unless his attitude is that he can be a counselor and helper of this religious movement. Yeah, and all religious movements for that matter. All Buddhism and Theosophy and Hindus, we should be helping them. Yeah, and, instead we've got the same, the youth movement. Everybody's like kind of the boss of every little movement and the Anthroposophical Society. And I think that accidentally corrupts the pure intention and activity and the freedom. But who am I to say? Steiner. But unless his attitude is that he can be a counselor and helper to this religious movement, but cannot directly immerse himself in it. If he were to do so, he would be working for two ends. Firstly, for the ruin and destruction of the Anthroposophical Society. Secondly, to make fruitless the movement for religious renewal. Whoa. Did you get that? Hey, let's go to part 2. That's heavy duty. And the Anthroposophical Society and the Anthroposophical movement is here for the whole world. It's not an Essene elitist group. And that's why I'm a member of the Anthroposophical Society and have been a member of the first class. I was a member of the Esoteric School of Theosophy. I was a member of the Theosophical Society and discovered Steiner in secret books in the basement while I worked there in a secret library underneath the library. But we'll talk about that later. Get to the next one. This is Robert of MayflowerBookshop.com. I love you. I love you. Let's keep learning. Till the whole world's enlightened, may we be friends.